Project Scope Management. First, let's be clear on what scope actually is. The book answer reads something like this. Project Scope Management includes the processes necessary to ensure that the project includes all the work required and only the work required to complete the project successfully. Being a simple man, I like to describe a project as an effort to make something true that isn't true now. You might be building something, maybe you're inventing something that doesn't currently exist. Perhaps the project will result in a concept being documented or communicated. A project could be as simple as an effort where you're just going to clean up a mess. In all these cases, something will be true when you finish the project that wasn't true when you started. From that perspective, project scope management would be the act of clearly defining the thing that isn't true now, but will be true when you finish the project. There are two important concepts in project scope management. One is capturing and communicating the thing that will be true, that is, stating what the project will do. The other, probably just as important, is clearly communicating what will not be a part of this project. Imagine I had a project to build a new kitchen, and it was going to be the kitchen of the future where all food was going to be fresh. Now, let's suppose I didn't want an oven in the kitchen because I felt cooking food was processing food, and if food is processed, it isn't fresh. Would others come to the same conclusion on their own? Kitchens have always had ovens and stoves, so most architects would probably conclude that if they were designing a kitchen, it should include an oven and a stove and maybe even a microwave. So in my case, I would need to create a scope that makes it very clear that installing cooking devices such as stoves and ovens is not in scope. Defining scope is not just about what you are going to do, it's also about what you aren't. The PMBOK from PMI talks about the processes that are part of determining project scope. Their list includes collect requirements, define scope, create WBS, verify scope, and control scope. Let's quickly explain what happens during each of these steps. Collect requirements. The requirements document is intended to define the project stakeholder needs. We need to be clear, however, that capturing and documenting everything that the key stakeholders want is not the goal of collecting requirements. First, the key stakeholders typically don't have the exact same requirements. Ultimately, the project sponsor gets to decide which requirements matter and which ones do not. But now I'm getting into step number 4. I teach new project managers that their job is not to meet all the requirements. The job, done best, is to manage the requirements. For years, I have believed that the HP printer should have a teleportation feature that facilitates the paper trays filling themselves when the paper gets low. I might communicate this as part of my requirements for the next HP printer design, but collecting this requirement and adding it to the requirements document would position my project for failure. Define scope. Defining scope is the act of capturing what is and is not going to happen as a result of the project. PMBOK says this is the process of developing a detailed description of the project and product. I might say this is the process of developing a detailed description of what will be true when the project is done. Create WBS. WBS stands for Work Breakdown Structure. The WBS is used to fully understand what the project deliverables are. The structure starts at a very high level and decomposes the deliverables while creating a hierarchy of these deliverables. Once you get to the most detailed level, which we call work package, it's possible to come up with all of the steps necessary to produce the deliverable. Verify scope. The PMBOK tells us this step is all about checking to ensure that the deliverables meet the acceptance and completion criteria. The idea is that you collect documentation from the customer or sponsor acknowledging formal acceptance of the project's deliverables. Control scope. In a perfect world, the scope on your project would be static and never change. Sorry, you don't live in a perfect world and probably never will, so we need to have some methods and processes wrapped around keeping the project scope under control as the world around you and the scope changes. The PMBOK has these steps in this order, and for the most part, this order is good. That said, it doesn't quite work like this in real life. If I was going to read all this picture so it matched reality, I would have to do it like this. Here's a more real-world view of the 5 steps in scope management. First, notice that the final 2 steps, verify scope and control scope, have been moved to the back. Notice that the numbers have been removed from the collect requirements, define scope, and create WBS. I do this because I believe the order is actually problematic and misleading. The numbers would suggest that these must be done in a certain order, yet in a real project you don't collect the requirements prior to defining the scope. You also don't wait until the requirements and scope are done before you begin work on the WBS. Actually, if I wanted to make this picture even more accurate, I would add this. Adding these rings is intended to suggest that development of these first three portions of the project scope is iterative in nature. None is done first, none is done last. When I'm developing the scope for a new project, I will commonly write the overview section of the scope statement and get the high-level deliverables from the project charter. I will then jump right into the WBS and work out what the deliverables should be. Once I have the WBS decomposed down to a work package level, I'll start building my requirements artifacts to further refine the requirements as well as address other project needs. During the requirements, I often discover new deliverables, so I must update the WBS. At some point, when I have the WBS and requirements close to completion, I'll go back in and work on the scope definition document some more. During the many reviews and status meetings, the sponsor will often point out things that they want changed in the requirements. Making these changes, I often find that I need to update the WBS again. After multiple iterations of this, I may need to make some changes to the scope statement so that it's in sync with the WBS and requirement changes. Finally, after many iterations of the scope definition, WBS, and requirements, we're at a point where the project sponsor and I agree that we have a good mutual understanding of what the project will and will not do. Now, we're ready to review the documents one last time, get sign-off, and the scope can be baselined. Will it change after the baseline? Sure it will, and that's why we have the control scope step, but the control scope step is a subject for another lecture. This is a pretty good overview of what happens as we develop our project scope, but you probably don't have enough detail about documenting the requirements and creating the WBS yet, so I'll do another video lecture on each of these subjects.